Hope you have enjoyed your lunch. Now, our next session, Global Economic Shocks. How can Australia and Asia cope? Can China be the savior in a perfect economic storm? And on the stage, we have now with us the moderator, Tan Sri Dr. Raymond Navaratnam. He's the chairman, Center for Public Policy Studies, and a corporate advisor of Sunway Group. And the panel speakers are His Excellency Ambassador Zhu Mingrong, Executive Vice Chairman, China National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation, Mr. Rajiv Biswas, Chief Economist of IHS Group Singapore, and Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, President of Economic Strategy Institute USA. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to hand over the floor to Tan Sri Navaratnam.
Thank you very much. I can't believe they are more interested in the lunch than a good discussion here. This doesn't speak so well for dialogues. Shall we give them just a minute more? And when they hear some sounds from here, they might feel guilty enough to come in. We can have a karaoke here. Hello, can we ring the ice cream bell or something outside? Hello, people outside, can you hear me? Would you come in? You know, it's supposed to be 2 o'clock, it's now 2:20, yeah? By my relation watch, that may not work so well. Can you all please come in? Yeah, maybe once you close the door, then they'll know they'll have to break it open to come in. I feel that to do justice to the speakers, more should be here, but they are very generous. They say, we can start now, so we'll start now. I want to welcome you all warmly. I can see that although it's not a full crowd, it's a very warm, enthusiastic crowd. And that's because you've had a good lunch, and you know we've got tremendously good speakers. So let me welcome you warmly. If I may also say, Selamat Datang and Ni Hao. Is that the right way? Yeah. And we're talking about China, Australia, Asia, ASEAN, so let's get as much of that spirit as possible. Now, the earlier speeches, if I may say, were very, very good, but there was not much public or rather people's or even audience participation. So with your agreement, I'd like to suggest to the speakers that they limit it to about 10 or so minutes. And then, because we already spent almost 25 minutes, and then we can have questions and answers or just comments. The title is The Global Economic Shocks. How can Australia cope? Can China be the savior, not only of Asia, but of the world, in a perfect storm? And how do we go about promoting a better world from our side of the house? And so these are challenging questions. I myself get the impression from this morning that everybody recognizes the great potential of the role of China, of ASEAN, of Australia, and the new Silk Route, as they call it, starting up from this part and going up through India, subcontinent, and to the Middle East. The question is whether through fora like this, we might be able to achieve something instead of being rhetorical about it. Instead of saying, this is what we can do, we'll say, look, how do we go about it? And we want to measure our success and monitor our progress. Would that be agreeable? We take that kind of theme. I'd also like to invite the speakers to be very free, open, because, we're all brothers and sisters committed to the same objective. So it's best when we are free and easy and open in our discussion. Now, our first speaker today is Ambassador Zhao. He's had tremendous experience. I can see that he started his career in '65, and he's been in Melbourne as a councillor, and then he rises up to become ambassador, and he's still very active in Beijing, apparently regarded as an authority on translation and insights into what other people think about China and how we should interpret it to his government. So I have great pleasure now in calling Ambassador Zhao to address us. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very sorry to keep you awake after this sumptuous lunch. Now, let me first have a quick review of some of the important figures for China. Now, China's economic situation today and its road ahead. First, in the last 33 years, since 1978, China has been able to maintain a GDP growth around 10% and a bit more for the last 33 years. And the proposed GDP for the 11th five-year plan, that's from 2006 to 2010, is only 7.5, but the actual performance is 11.2. And China's GDP stood at $5.9 trillion in 2010. That year, China being the second largest economy next to the US. And China's last year's GDP stood at $7.3 trillion. But the per capita average is only $5,270, much lower than even Malaysia. It is expected that a moderate growth for this year, between 7.5 to 8%. We've seen the first quarter 8.1, second quarter 7.6, and the third quarter 7.4. In the last quarter, we see a rebound already. We see the PMI in October 50.2, and also a very low CPI. So we expect that the last quarter GDP will be around higher than 7.5, but closer to 8 points. So generally speaking, for this year, we are quite confident to achieve a growth of around 8%, which we call it a slowdown. But this slowdown is still the highest in the world. And important factors for the economic slowdown in recent years in China are three. One is uncertainties of the external demand, very weak economic recovery in America, in Europe, and also very sluggish world market. So this is very much due to the external causes. Second is the domestic reason. We have taken measures by the Chinese government to execute a macroeconomic control and readjustment to achieve a growth model driven by domestic consumption and bring about a balanced international payment. It is aimed at a soft landing of the overheated industrial sectors, especially the housing sector. While when we give this macro control, we curbed the GDP growth, we curbed the overheating, but at the same time, we also decelerated China's overall growth. And the third is the cycle of the 4-year stimulant package since 2008 has come to an end, with most of the infrastructure projects completed already. So in face of the global economic uncertainties, the Chinese government will continue to take effective measures to achieve a steady economic growth and remold the growth pattern, along with the economic recovery in the US and Europe. An average of 8% growth is expected for next year or even higher. And now what the Chinese government will do in the near future, I will just go briefly. This is not official, my personal observation, I would say. One is the export-led and investment-driven mode of economic growth is going to be transformed. 3 shifts will be made, I presume. One is a shift from the investment and export to domestic consumption. The second shift is from the labor-intensive industries, from the coastal regions moving to the central and western regions. And the third shift is the coastal regions achieve a shift of industrial upgrading by developing high-tech industries. And the second major measure to be taken by the Chinese government in the near future might be to make efforts to increase private and individual consumption ratio in the whole GDP. Efforts will be made to raise the portion of national income in the GDP, raise taxation of the high-income sectors, distribute public wealth among the middle and low-income sectors. And the third measure would be the vicious economic development cycle must be completely transformed. That in old days, when we have an economic slowdown, well, the normal practice is to take stimulant policy measures, packages, then resulting in investment heating and surplus production capacities, then followed again by macroeconomic control and resulting again in this slowdown. This sort of pattern, I think, must be completely changed by the Chinese new government. And the fourth measure by the new government may be to carry out a thorough industrial restructuring. China's worry today is not the growth, is not the growth rate, but rather the growth quality. And in early September, the Chinese government released another 1 trillion RMB investment package to maintain a moderate economic growth by approving 60 infrastructure projects, mainly in railways, energy saving, environment sectors, road construction in western regions, civilian airports, education institutions, health facilities, and information technologies, etc. The investment package is coupled with interest rate cut to release more bank loans. Now, the actual effect of this measure is better than expected. Mr. Yi Gang, who is Vice Governor of China's Central Bank, said recently that China will continue with an economic stimulant package, the scope of which shall be appropriately big enough to ensure a steady economic growth, but not too big a package to bring about any negative effects, like overheating. He further said that China's main 4 policy goals are, first, to prevent inflation, second, to ensure a steady growth, third, to increase employment, and lastly, maintain both internal and external balance of payment. Despite of China's economic slowdown, Chinese consumers are still quite optimistic about their status quo. A survey by Financial Times in early October showed that about 40% of Chinese consumers are ready to spend more in the next 12 years than the previous next 12 months. Now, my second section will deal with China is capable of maintaining another 20 years of relatively high growth. When I say relatively high, it's between 8 to 9%. It is expected that by 2020, when China's GDP equals more or less that of the US, and by then, RMB may be internationalized by then, and Hong Kong may likely become a global financial center. The number of Chinese companies may reach half of the world's top 500. Today, the mainland had 73, and Taiwan had 5 companies among the world's top 500 corporations. To achieve that, China must maintain a relatively high growth for decades. I believe this is not an illusion, but something tangible. My argument is based on the following 3 reasons. The first reason is there's a big scope to maintain a high growth in view of China's per capita national income. China's per capita national income of 2008 is only about 21% of that of the US on that year. And that level equals Japan of 1951, Singapore of 1967, and Korea 1977. And on that level, Japan maintained 20 years of GDP growth at 9.2%, Singapore 8.6%, and Korea 7.6%. So in line with that model, economic model, China will be able to maintain a relatively high growth, say between 8 to 9% GDP per year for another 2 decades. My second reason is that there's currently a major shift to China's industries from the coastal regions to the central and the western regions. It is normally expected that the coastal regions, after another 3 to 4 years of high growth, may gradually enter a period of moderate growth, hopefully for another 10, 15, or 20 years. And during that period, you see a shift of these labor-intensive industries, manufacturing industries, moving from the coastal regions to the central western regions. And this is already seen, say, taken, for instance, of the Chengdu of Sichuan province. It is already taking place there. And the GDP growth for Chengdu has been able to maintain over 10% annually for a couple of years already. And global companies like Bosch, GM, Siemens have all chosen Chengdu to expand their investment, bringing about Chengdu's GDP growth for this year 20 percentage points higher than the national average. And my third reason is China's urbanization, which was mentioned earlier by another Chinese economist this morning. That is, China's urbanization today stands at 51%, and the global average is 75%. That means China has a space of another 25% of urbanization. And that means another 350 million Chinese will be urbanized, will leave the land and live in urban areas. And you can imagine this market demand for these 350 million people. So that will also be a reason to drive China's economic growth for the next 2 decades. And in addition to these 3 reasons, by 2030, China's per capita national income shall reach only 50%, half of the US today. However, China's population is 5 times bigger than that of the US. So China shall continue to be an attractive market for consumer goods and investment. And my third section deals with China wishes to become a stabilizer of the global economy, not its savior. To rid the world of a global economic crisis, we need concerted efforts especially concerted efforts from the developed countries headed by the US. At a time when global economic crisis is increasingly felt in China, what would China do? The US released QE1. I believe it's important and imperative, but QE2 seems a bit counterproductive, actually slowing down its recovery. Now we have the QE3. Whether QE3 would achieve its desired effect, reduce US unemployment, we've got to wait and see. QE3 may bring short-term benefits to global market, but we should not underestimate its medium and long-term negative effects to global economy, especially to developing economies, including China. And for China, so far as China is concerned, we shall continue with our market-oriented economic reform, press forward also exchange rate reform, and extend the flexibility of the exchange rate of RMB. China adopted a limited stimulant package by releasing only 1 trillion RMB, not as the year of 2008 package, which was coupled with enormous amount of loans. And in the near future, there will be a change of government in China, and the new government will be formed to do its job March next year. I'm quite confident that the new government should unfold and enforce a new round of economic reform measures, centering, I believe, on the four following aspects. That is, first, to ensure that by 2015, a market-oriented financial reform on both interest rate and exchange rate. Two will be a tax transformation from indirect taxation to direct taxation. Three, there will be a transformation in the public and social sectors characterized by equalization of social services. And lastly, reform of income distribution aimed at equality and efficiency. And though faced with greater pressure and challenges, China will endeavor to maintain a steady growth. But we need concerted efforts the world over. And the fourth section deals with the new party and the government leadership. I would say, I just mentioned that they know China's rural situation. Most of them went through China's Cultural Revolution. They know the rural areas. Two, they have received high education, both at home and abroad. So they are knowledgeable people, and they also know the world, and they are reform-minded. And lastly, we hope for the best and prepare for the worst at time of crisis. I think our region has seen the birth of PEC, which I represent in China National Committee in 1980, and APEC 9 years afterwards. In addition, a number of other regional organizations like ASEAN 10+1, 10+3, and 10+6 EAS are also contributing to the regional development. I think what we need here, 3 points. One is efforts should be made to strengthen our connectivity in time of crisis, both physical and soft. Two is we should try to maintain the continuity of various proposals for this region. Three is we should try to promote coherence and inclusiveness among different regional institutions. And to overcome the current crisis, we need to observe and advance 3 C's. 3 C's, that is confidence, cooperation, and concerted efforts. And lastly, China is an important member of the region. Today, China's economy has shown evidence of an upward turn. We shall fully tap its growth potentials, ward off any adverse eventualities, and maintain a steady growth in the next decade so as to contribute our share to the regional as global economic recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I was threatening to call it an end, but your timing was excellent. You need a clap for that. I think you ended up on a very nice note. What we need and what you say relates to all our country experiences. Cooperation, confidence, and concerted efforts. Now I go on to Mr. Rajesh Biswas. He's a familiar person, a face in Malaysia and Singapore and around in ASEAN. And he's been around studying ASEAN and ASEAN's relationship with China and the rest of the world for many years. And we consider him an expert in our part of the world. Now let's see what he has got to say from the perspective of Southeast Asia. Dr. Biswas.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I would like to thank Tan Sri Michael Yeo for the kind invitation to join you here today, and also to Asli, of course, for the invitation. In the moments that I have, and I know I've got a very strict moderator as well, that I want to cover the very quick overview of the outlook for the global situation, with particular reference to the role of China. But I don't only want to talk about China, but also take some broader perspectives about the region as a whole. These slides you can get later if anyone wants them. You're welcome to have them if you approach me. Let me first start off by showing you how we see the outlook for the next decade for all the major regions of the global economy. As you can see in the heading Other Asia Pacific, in the red bars, you can see the outlook till 2020. And our expectation is that the emerging Asian region will be the fastest growing region of the global economy over the decade ahead and beyond that, which I think largely echoes some of the comments by some of the other distinguished speakers today. And at the heart of this rapid economic growth that we foresee for the Asia-Pacific region is China. We very much believe that China will be the major driver of the Asia-Pacific growth story over the next 20 years. But it's not only China. We think there's three major drivers for the region as a whole. Firstly, China. Secondly, India, but also ASEAN increasingly is playing an important role. When we look at what's happening in China, we think that this sort of very rapid growth momentum that we've seen over the last 3 decades of averaging 10% growth per year will not be sustained over the next 20 years. Basically, no economy can continue to grow at 10% per year forever. And the 12th five-year plan of the Chinese government also envisages growth at about 7.5% over the next 5 years. And I would expect similar sort of slight moderation in their expectations beyond that. And there's a couple of major reasons why we think the growth rate will tend to be in the 7 to 8% range over the next decade. Firstly, aging demographics.
Let me just ask, can you all hear? Is all right? If you can't, please put up your hand, especially behind.
Aging demographics and also declining marginal productivity of capital will be factors that will gradually result in a tapering off of the growth rate of China. And then up to 2030, we expect that will continue and growth will moderate to perhaps around about 6 to 6.5% by 2030. But nevertheless, this still represents pretty rapid economic growth for what we believe will become the world's largest economy in about 10 years' time. As I mentioned, we also believe India and ASEAN will play an important role in the coming years. We think the GDP of India will exceed Japan in about 10 years' time. Of course, per capita GDP will still be far below Japan, but nevertheless, this represents an important driver. And the third factor is ASEAN, where we believe that the total GDP of ASEAN, which currently is $2.3 trillion and already larger than India, will grow to about $10 trillion by 2030. So these are the three factors that we believe will continue to result in very strong growth in Asia Pacific, and in the growth of Asia, we're also going to see strong drivers for the rest of the emerging markets as well. If you look at the other regions, if you look at it, Middle East, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, and also other Americas, which is Latin America, this strong growth in Asia will create rapid growth in demand for commodities, for oil and gas, for coal, also for agricultural commodities, as we heard earlier today, and also for metals. So this will be very beneficial for other emerging markets, and of course, it'll also be very beneficial for Australia. The more difficult outlook is in the developed countries, as you see, where we expect Japan will still be growing very weakly over the decade ahead, and Western Europe is in the middle of a lost decade due to fiscal austerity and the need to have further significant bank deleveraging over the next few years. The US is in a better shape, we believe. It's a more flexible and dynamic economy, and it's also getting a lot of benefit from lower energy costs due to the development of unconventional gas. Let me now just highlight the rise of China. In this chart here, you can see in the red bars, the very substantial ascent of China. If you look at 2011 in the middle there, you can see that China at the moment is still smaller than the EU and the US. But when you look to 2030, you see that China actually becomes considerably larger than both the EU and the US. So if you think about where we already are and how important China already is for the rest of the Asia Pacific and for the rest of the global economy, and then you see where the GDP is heading of China relative to the other major regions, there's still a lot more momentum that we expect to come that will boost economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. The other thing to notice is India. Although India remains much smaller than China, as I mentioned, we expect in about 10 years' time that the Indian economy will become larger than Japan. So this is a second driver for the region. And I think the third factor is ASEAN. And these are our forecasts for the ASEAN region. As I say, we believe it will be a $10 trillion economy by 2030. And at the heart of that is Indonesia, which we think will become basically from today, where it's a $1 trillion economy, it'll become a $4.4 trillion economy by 2030. But also there's 3 other countries that will become $1 trillion economies in ASEAN. One is Malaysia, the second is Philippines, and the third is Thailand. So we're really seeing a lot of momentum in the ASEAN region, which will also help to boost regional economic growth. And just as an illustration of that, the latest Chinese trade data, which was surprisingly strong in the last 2 months, one of the reasons for the strength of Chinese trade growth, export growth, has been ASEAN. Growth to the ASEAN economies of Chinese exports has been very, very strong in the last few months. And indeed, over the last 20 years, we've seen a very strong growth in the overall trade relationship. And what about the impact on Australia? In this chart here, you can see Australian exports to China and to the EU as a share of total Australian exports. And in the red bar, you can see the share of Chinese exports, Australian exports to China. As you see, back in 1991, it was a very, very small share of total Australian exports. But look at how rapidly that's transformed. By 2011, it's now reached 27% of total Australian exports. So this has been a huge transformation in the Australia-China trade relationship over the last 2 decades. And I think in the last decade, one of the reasons Australia has really weathered the global economic crises very well has been this very rapid growth in the relationship with China. On the other hand, the dependency on trade with the EU has gradually declined. And I think this is a sort of double-edged sword, of course. It means that China has very much helped Australia to weather the difficult economic times. But in the future, we could envisage that that share may rise further. And as the former Fed chairman Greenspan used to always say, the business cycle has not been repealed. And even China may in the future have business cycles with downturns that impact hard on other Asian countries. And clearly Australia will be vulnerable given its high trade share with China in that sort of situation. So I think clearly Australia's diversifying trade relationships with other Asian trade partners will also be important to help to mitigate that potential vulnerability in the future. What about the risks for the year ahead? I think when we look at where the global economy is, I would point to four major risks. Firstly, the Eurozone crisis we think could escalate further next year. The problems of Greece and Spain are far from resolved, so that's a major downside risk. China hard landing we think is a risk over the next couple of years, but the probability of this has diminished, we think, in the recent months. The US fiscal cliff clearly is a big risk that's imminent. It's forthcoming by the early part of next year that US Congress needs to come to a deal, or else the US could go back into recession. And the fourth is an Iran oil price shock if there's military action in the Strait of Hormuz. So we are looking at a fragile global economic environment in the year ahead. And I think China is, at the moment, showing signs of improvement that may help to weather that difficult economic situation. As I say, China, we expect to be an economy in transition over the next few years. And in the blue line, you can see we expect the Chinese economy to gradually moderate over the next few years, but still remain in a growth pace of about 7 to 8% per year. And although we are seeing a growth deceleration over the last sort of couple of years from the very high levels back in 2010, I think those rates that we saw in 2010 were unsustainable. That was reflected in high inflation in China, and we think the potential growth rate in the range of about 7 to 8 is a more sustainable growth rate for China. One of the reassuring signs that we see in China at the moment is that power demand in China is still holding up pretty well compared to the end of 2008. If you look at 2008, you see what a big slump there was in power demand in China in the industrial sector. And we simply haven't seen that kind of sharp decline. Indeed, the latest data is starting to turn a little bit more positive. So that's another reassuring factor that China at the moment is really having a slowdown and more of a soft landing and not a hard landing. I think I'll sort of skip a couple of slides and just highlight a few points about the outlook for China. We do believe that the development of inland China will continue to be a major driver for the growth of China over the decade ahead. Clearly, the coastal Chinese provinces have developed very rapidly in the last 20 years, and per capita incomes have been increasingly high in the coastal provinces relative to inland China. But now I think there's a lot of government focus on developing the inland Chinese provinces. There's a lot of urban development, there's a lot of transport infrastructure development, and increasingly we're seeing that the high wages of coastal China are resulting in some sort of hollowing out happening and the shift of some of the manufacturing in the low-cost sectors towards the inland China provinces. So these factors we think are structural factors which will continue to support the growth of the Chinese economy. We're going to see rapid investment in infrastructure for years to come, and also in urban development. So we still believe that this urbanization of the western provinces will be an important supportive factor for the growth of China over the long term. So I think when we look at the Asia-Pacific perspective over the decade ahead, we're still confident that the Chinese economy will continue to deliver relatively strong growth, which will help to temper or mitigate the impact of the Eurozone difficulties on the Asia-Pacific region. It can't completely isolate Asia if Eurozone goes into a deep shock next year, but certainly what we have seen is a mitigation of the impact, and our expectation is that China will grow at about 7.5% next year as well, which will help to, again, help Asia to weather the Eurozone economic storm that we're seeing. So I think it's generally a positive outlook for the Asia-Pacific, supported by China, first of all, but also by the rise in the future of India and ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. I sense that you have considerable confidence You're looking up to 2013, 2014 perhaps. But I think from the chair, I feel still a bit concerned about the longer term outlook. You got linchpins around the world. The US has weakened. Euro doesn't show signs of picking up. China is talking about, and it's impressive growth. We all admire it. But the question is, can it be sustained? And maybe I'll ask Dr. Clyde to elaborate on it. He's been in research in the US for a long time. He keeps tabs not only on the US, but the whole world. And I'm sure after the elections, he'll come with new thoughts and new insights into how maybe the American economy will perform and how it can affect the rest of the world.
Thank you very much.
Aren't you going to give a big clap?
You don't have to. Let me thank Tan Sri Michael Yo and ASLI for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to Australia, to Melbourne. And this topic is the hottest topic in the world. And so it's very good to be involved in this discussion. I should preface my remarks by telling you that I am a veteran of the economic issues that arose with Japan, between Japan and the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s. I was the chief negotiator for the Reagan administration with Japan at that time. And so I remember, for example, that I think it was in 1988, the imperial palace of the Japanese royal family in the center of Tokyo was given a value that was greater than the value of the state of California. There was serious discussion in Japan and elsewhere at that time about Japan becoming, surpassing the US in GDP and dominating global industries and so forth. So I explained that by way of saying that what I want to do today, and I'll do this very quickly because I want to get into some discussion with you in the audience, is I want to raise some caution, some cautionary flags about how we're thinking of the evolution of the global economy and whether or not we're seeing the whole picture and properly interpreting it. For example, let's take one of the questions that's on the agenda for this session is, will China save the EU? Well, honestly, I think the EU is committing suicide. And I don't think China can stop the EU from committing suicide. And I think that the EU is going into a kind of a free fall. I expect that the EU GDP will have negative growth for 2013, possibly as much as 3 or 4% negative growth. I don't think China can fix that. And actually, China, it's not China's job to fix that. The means of fixing the EU are in the EU. The EU does not lack for money. The EU has the money, it has the resources, it has the ability to fix that. It has simply decided not to. But that decision, I think, is going to be a heavy weight on the global economy. It'll be a particularly heavy weight on the US because the EU is America's largest trading partner. I want to underscore that because in many of these discussions, we often talk about bilateral trade relationships. We often talk about Canada is America's biggest trading partner, or Japan is America's third largest trading partner, or China is, I forget what the number of China is. But the truth is that the EU is the biggest economy in the world. The EU is already a bigger economy than the US economy. And the EU is America's biggest trading partner. And if it has negative growth, that is going to be a serious problem for the U.S. economy. U.S. economy is emerging from recession slowly. This has been the slowest recovery from recession in a very long time. In fact, if you look at the economic statistics in the U.S., based on the statistics, President Obama should not have won the election, but he did. But his job now is going to be to try to keep this slow recovery going. Right now, U.S. economy is growing at about 2%. But keep in mind that the U.S. economy has a chronic, large trade deficit of over 3% of GDP. Sorry. Most economists believe that trade deficits in excess of 3% of GDP are not sustainable. The U.S. has been running an unsustainable trade deficit for quite some time. That's not to say that it will collapse tomorrow. It's not to say that there will be a big problem tomorrow. I believe the U.S. can continue to have a large trade deficit for a while. But it's probably not sustainable long term, and it's a drag on economic growth. And so a big problem that Obama faces is how to achieve economic growth with this very large trade deficit, particularly in view of the fact that because of the already very high debt of the U.S., because of the difficulty of adding more stimulus, more macro stimulus to the economy, he won't be able to do that very much. And so his problem is how to achieve growth without much stimulus and with a large trade deficit. And again, that then brings us back to China. Can China fill the role of the EU in the global economy? Can China provide a role that will enable President Obama to make this kind of shift? Will China, in fact, continue to grow as we've been saying that it will grow here today? And honestly, I don't know. I've listened to the presentations, and I think they're all quite good. I think they're all soundly based. So I just want to raise a few questions. I have some slides here. Let me run through them quickly. I don't know if these slides are really, you can get them at the close of the session. But the one that I wanted to particularly, I mean, we know that China's growth pattern is somewhat declining. But look at this. Look at the middle here. Private consumption as a percent of GDP has fallen from 1995. Fixed asset investment has risen. Public consumption is kind of flat. Exports have been up or down. Now, China's economy, we often say in these meetings that China has an export-led economy. I would rather say China has an investment-led economy. China has made enormous investment. That is actually similar to the experience of the other Asian economies. First Japan, then Korea, then Taiwan, Singapore, and now China. All of them adopted a high investment, high export, high growth strategy. Now, the thing is that if you are investing at very high rates, obviously you cannot invest 100% of GDP. There's some point at which investment becomes counterproductive. And if you look at China, I think that you could ask the question, has China reached that point? For every new dollar of investment, how much growth does China get? I think that's a question that maybe we should try to pay more attention to. Then the second question is, China has committed and has explained to shift the structure of the economy away from investment more towards consumption. I understand that, and I support it. And I very, very much hope that China's leaders can make that happen. But I have to tell you that I was personally in the room in 1984 when then Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan promised President Reagan that Japan would become an importing consumption superpower. Well, we're now 30 years down the road, and Japan is not an importing consumption superpower. Not because Nakasone-san was not telling the truth, not because he wasn't sincere. He was very sincere. He meant it. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do. If I turn it around, because in the U.S. we have the opposite situation. In the U.S. we consume too much. We overconsume, we underinvest. So we in the U.S. keep saying we're going to invest more, we're going to save more, we're going to produce more, and we're going to consume less. That's what we say, but that's not what we do. Because the structure of the economy, the structure of the politics gets organized in a certain way. And just to give you one example, in the last year of President Bush's administration, there was an informal committee in the White House to look at tax reform. One of the tax reforms that was suggested was to change the way in which the interest that homeowners pay on their mortgages is calculated. As soon as word of that discussion got out, every bank, every real estate agent, every construction company in America descended upon Washington to stop it because it would have meant less consumption. So what I'm saying is it's very hard to do. My time is almost up here, but let me make two more points. One is that China it has already begun to age. The demographics of China are not good. China will face a problem of aging and shrinking population, just as Japan and Korea already do, just as Germany already does. That will make it difficult to achieve sustained high levels of growth. For example, right now, China has about 5 times the population and also 5 times the workforce of the US. But by 2030, it will be 3 times. So that means in order to maintain the growth, the productivity of the Chinese workers has to rise disproportionately. Not impossible, it could happen, I'm just raising it as an issue. The last point I want to make is that the Asian economies, I think, are all more dependent on exports to the West than they think. And the reason I say that is because when we hear these discussions that China is the biggest trading partner of ASEAN, or Japan is the largest trading partner of country X, whatever. When you look at these numbers, remember that there is a lot of supply chain phenomenon in those numbers. So a component is made in Singapore, goes to China, gets assembled, goes to the EU, goes to the US. So the question that I think we have to ask is, when looking at the trade numbers, is how much of what is made in Singapore or Malaysia or Japan stays in China after it's sold to China? How much of it stays in China? That's the true trade. And if we looked at those numbers, I think we'd see the picture in maybe a little bit different fashion. So I guess my bottom line is this. I think the global economy is facing some difficult times. And I think that it's very important for China to continue trying to do what it's trying to do. I support it. I hope it succeeds. But I think the rest of the world cannot look upon China as a savior. I think the rest of the world has got to organize its own activities and its own policies in a way that enables them to sustain growth as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clyde. We really want to appreciate the sense of timing of our speakers, because although we started late, we have caught up with time, and we got a good 20 minutes or so for question time so that we don't exceed it and don't get into the area of the next session. Now, let me now ask for the first question. Now, I'm glad we got prompt response. Please, sir. Can someone provide the mic? You'll have to give your name, and I always say in Malaysia, your serial number as well. You'll have to speak into the mic. How do we cope with the world economy if we can't handle the mic?
Hi, it's better?
That's better.
Too loud now. My name is Chep Chow. I'm the People's Australia's Ambassador's appointee of Madam Prime Minister Julie Gillard, Prime Minister of Australia. Now, I'm here today as a novice, as a dilettante, as a Philistine of economic matters. I've got one for Your Excellency. So good to see you back here in Melbourne. And I've got two for Mr. Clyde Prestwick. For Your Excellency, Ambassador Joe, China has been quite reluctant to have its currency internationalized, thereby allowing USA to have all the commodity and metals denominated in the greenback, and which enables USA to print money without suffering the hyperinflation. Is there any prospect of China relaxing this restriction and thereby eliminating and mitigating the negative effect in the global economy? Should I ask the questions first? The two, or one at a time? Should I ask the other two questions as well?
Hello? Okay. Well, Romney said China is a currency manipulator. I don't agree, so he lost. Well, just look back into the last couple of months or so, you see both the appreciation and depreciation of RMB. That is an indication that the RMB has been let to float by more market forces, not being manipulated. Otherwise, we wouldn't see up and down again. This appreciation in recent weeks is due very much to the QE3 of the US. As you know, Hong Kong has issued serious warnings against the influx of hot monies. So as I mentioned in my address, that in the next couple of years, up to 2015, China may very seriously go into the study and implementation of this transformation of the currency problem. Hopefully, we'll be able to achieve the convertibility of the RMB under the capital account, hopefully before 2020. So I would say that the measures are being taken very seriously by the Chinese government, and also serious academic studies are being done by the academic circles, but also financial officials as well. And so that we'll, as a growing and one of the big economies in the world, manipulation of the currency wouldn't work with a big economy. I think the good thing is the government has realized that we've got to let the currency float and do as the majority of the developed countries do. But give us a timing. We need time to follow all these things, and we need to learn and practice in our the actions. Thank you.
I get the impression one can afford to float only when one is stronger.
Yeah, good.
But please, the next question.
Good. To Mr. Clyde Prestwick. The decoupling of EU and USA, of course, is primarily important. Would USA exert some sort of initiative to have that happen, or rely on EU for its own self-discipline? That's one question. Another question is that...
Can I please ask him to answer, and I'll go around asking whether other people have questions. Actually, you know, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but
must
no,
ask
this
it.
side, you can't hear. The sound, something is wrong with the sound. There's an echo. or
Do you
something.
hear the question? Do you hear the question? The decoupling of EU and USA, and who should take the active part? And second question is, in Obama's second term, right? Would he do a principle? Do he adopt a principle of let ballots be ballot and bite the bullet, and go and patch up the differences with the Congress in view of the potential hemorrhaging effect of fiscal cliff? Thank you.
Thank you very much. With regard to the EU, I think that U.S. has been having extensive discussions with the EU, urging particularly Germany to increase stimulus to its economy. These discussions just have not had much success. I think that the Obama administration may propose to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. And while I support that, you all know that negotiating those kinds of agreements can take quite some time. So I really have to say I think that the solution to the EU lies in the EU primarily. I think other countries are doing what they can, but it's an EU problem. As far as the U.S. Fiscal situation is concerned, I'm pretty confident that there will be an agreement before the end of the year to resolve the tax and budget problems. The reason I say that is because President Obama has now won election twice. So the American public has spoken twice now, and they have given him a pretty good majority. I think Florida was just declared for Obama yesterday. That means he won 336 electoral votes. He only needed 270. So I think he's in a strong position. I think the U.S. business community, particularly the leaders of the global companies, are putting a lot of pressure on the Republican leaders in the House of Representatives. Speaker Boehner has spoken carefully, but he has sent the message that he is prepared to negotiate. So I'm pretty confident that we will have an agreement and that this problem will get behind us. If I might, I'd just like to make a short comment on the currency issue. You made the point that the U.S., by printing dollars, the U.S. escapes kind of the responsibility for economic misdeeds. And that's true. I agree with you. And the ambassador has indicated that China wants to move toward having the RMB as a convertible currency. I say the faster the better. I want China to have a convertible currency because having a reserve currency, in this case the US dollar being the main reserve currency, it has benefits. It means that you can borrow in your own currency. It means that you can print money to pay your debts, at least in the short term, but it has negatives too. It tends to mean that you run a trade deficit. It tends to mean that you lose your manufacturing sector and that you lose employment and technology through that erosion of your manufacturing sector. So it's not an unmixed blessing, and I welcome China as a partner in sharing this pain. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Tony Fedderson from the Australia-China Business Council. Mr. Prestowitz, you raised the issue of Chinese debt, and I'm curious and interested to know from yourself, the ambassador, the panel, on how you see China managing its debt going forward.
I'm interested to hear the ambassador on that question. I'm not sure. I don't think China's debt is unmanageable. It's not at an unmanageable level, but it's at a higher level than most people recognize. And I think that there are always ways of addressing that. You can raise taxes, you can reduce spending, you can inflate, you can sequester. I'm not sure which way China will go. But I'm sure that the Chinese authorities have this in their radar screen.
Thank you. Any other question? We still got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Now, I'd like to ask a question, if I may. It seems to be a waiting game. We are saying, well, that the topic is, will China come to the rescue? Will China really redeem the situation? That's fine, and I think it's being done. I can see the gains in ASEAN. I can see the gains in Australia. If they depended on Europe and the US at this time as much as they did, I think we would be in trouble. So China has come to the rescue, not necessarily for its purely altruistic reasons, but it has been doing well. The question is, when is the US, there must be more confidence, or we must feel more confident that the US can settle its problems by the end of the year, or early next year. Now, that sense doesn't come through, and perhaps we need to justify that kind of statement more strongly so that we can all feel a bit more confident. On the other hand, China itself, there are pressures. You're already beginning to have some decline. Now, hopefully, it will not decline further. But then China cannot bear that kind of burden either. So let me get somebody outside the US, outside China, Viswas, to make his comment on my question.
Thank you. I think that, when we look at the US, we actually think that 2013 will be another year of moderate growth, but 2014, we're expecting to see some stronger momentum, and we think growth will reach about 3%. And the reason we believe that is that we think the housing sector, which has been in recession for 4 years, is gradually staging a recovery. And this is very important because every strong recovery in the US has been supported by a relatively good housing sector rebound. And this hasn't happened so far, but the data that we're seeing is quite encouraging. And so long as we don't go down this fiscal cliff route, we think that after consolidation next year, 2014 will be a better year for the housing construction recovery. So growth will pick up to about 3% in the US. Of course, this is very positive for the rest of the world economy. The other positive that's happening in the US right now is the significant reduction in energy costs due to the rapid development of unconventional gas. Natural gas prices in the US have fallen very sharply since 2008, and they continue to remain relatively low. That's already delivered very significant reductions in energy costs for households and corporates, and we think there'll be about $2 trillion of investment in the further development of shale gas in the US over the next 20 years. So that's another positive that is significant for the longer-term US outlook. So I think the flexibility of the US economy, the recovery of construction, the oil and gas renaissance in the US, these are some of the factors that make us more confident that the US growth rate will be probably around 2.5% over the medium to longer term. And positive economic growth obviously allows more rapid ability to cope with the fiscal debt problems than, say, what we're seeing in Europe, where they're trying to cut government debt in the middle of a recession, which is an extremely complicated exercise, as obvious. Turning to the question of China, the question of debt was raised in China. I might just revert to that because that, I think, is relevant to the longer-term outlook in China as well, that we do believe that the Chinese debt, although it is higher than the nominal government debt level that we see right now, if you bring in the state government debt contingent liabilities, that certainly probably would push the government debt level well above the 20% official level that it's at right now. But nevertheless, it's still, in our estimate, including contingent liabilities on the national government, probably in the region of about 50 to 60% of GDP. So it's still contained at a level where if China needs to, it could put in fiscal stimulus. Again, if the Eurozone goes into a much deeper crisis again. So I think the outlook is still, in our view, that over the next couple of years, China will be able to grow at about 7 to 8%, and the US recovery will continue. And meanwhile, the key concern is, can the Eurozone stumble along even at zero growth and gradually start to heal from its sovereign debt crisis? So we're still expecting a fragile global recovery, even over the medium term.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the ambassador to comment?
Yeah, speaking about the debt, I think we have to divide the issue into two levels. One is the national level, the other is provincial level. On the national level, I don't think it's a problem, though sometimes the budget is a little bit deficit, the budget, but the overall Chinese government debt is below 50% only, or around 50%. Besides, China is the biggest creditor of the US bonds also. So it's not a problem for the national government. But on the provincial level, a couple of years ago, there was an economist who sounded a bit warning that the provincial debts has reached almost very high level also. But now if you look at the problem is, all these provincial governments are financed, their debts are financed by the state-owned banks. And these 4 major banks are financially sound. So those provincials, they owe a lot of money to the banks, but the banks themselves are in good shape so far. And I also know that since 3 or 4 years ago, the national government has also taken measures for the provincial government to lower the debt level. So that has been going on for the last couple of 2 or 3 years. So we have seen a drop of the provincial level debt. That is curbing, that is one of the, we call macro readjustment policies by the national government, not only just on the manufacturing industry or housing industry, but also on the provincial government's financial situation well. So under that, we see a very healthy flow, a very development that the provincial governments are lowering their debt issues. And I don't think it's going to be an issue anymore.
So far, we've been talking about possible, present and possible. So far, we've been talking about present and possible shocks. And we've been talking about economic shocks. Does anybody from the floor or the panel want to consider the possibility of political, military shocks? Because that will have a major shock on all our economies. You want to comment on that point? Yes, please.
Can I not give my name? We're talking about monetary, this is non-monetary. How would China, being the most populous country in the world, deal with the next GFC, which is the global food crisis in 20, 30 years' time?
Well, that's a long haul, but it's an interesting and useful question. I think
this
we
is
all
not
got to be involved in that.
No?
Yes. Can anybody else respond? He talked about China, but he can apply to any country.
That's true, but China is the most populated country in the world.
Do they eat as much per capita as some others?
Being Chinese, we eat a lot.
Well, no nation is free of any problems. I would say, so far as I can see it, we have really full problem, full safety, not just full safety, but also full security as well. As a big populous nation, any stoppage of food supply would be disastrous. And not just that, during the course of our development, China has really come across many problems, environmental problems, ecology problems, and so far. So I mentioned that we must have sort of concerted efforts to have a sort of a sustainable development. And this is also one of the efforts China has also made to contribute to the global, or at least to the regional development. And concerning this sustainable development, we have to look at China from the two levels. The national government is very tough on a sort of sustainable development. But the provincial governments, out of their own particular interests, they would do the otherwise. Manufacturers, investors, for seeking profits may do otherwise. Take Foxconn, for example. It's a producer for accessories and spare parts for iPhones a lot of people use. But certain parts are produced sort of hazardous to the workers. So when the Guangdong government takes stronger control on the manufacture of these hazardous sort of production environment, Foxconn moved to Henan province, where it is welcomed because it brings investment and brings job opportunities. So we have to coordinate the interests of national level and the provincial level. And the government must toughen execution of laws and improvement of laws on these issues. And for this sustainable development on the regional level, this is also one of the goals China work for. In APEC, we have two goals. One is economic development, cooperation. The other is technological transfer. I think APEC has been doing quite well with the economic cooperation. This is seen in China-ASEAN relations. But technological transfer is lagging behind due to the reluctance on the part of developed economies on the transfer of technologies to developing economies, like technology is very important in maintaining the environment, in ecology also. So China is working on both ways, domestic efforts as well as the regional efforts, to make sure that we would have a better life for our next generation, and also a better environment for the countries and economies in this region. So food problem is just one of the issues within this larger complex. And we hope very much that the new government will all take these measures. I mentioned they are reform-minded. They should take tough measures to reform China politically, economically, as well as socially as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments? You can even comment. You don't need to ask a question. You can tell us we are all wrong. Yes, sir.
Hi, Michael Johnson from Kokoda Capital in Brisbane. I have a question to Rajiv. You talked about the region being a 10 trillion economy, and that also includes India. Is that right? Can I just clarify that?
Actually, it was ASEAN which will become a 10 trillion economy.
Oh, just ASEAN alone?
Yeah, just
okay,
ASEAN
I just want to clarify that. But you also mentioned comments about India. So if I can just, while I have the microphone, ask about that. Anybody who's been to India, anybody that knows India, has Indian friends, does business in India, knows that it's a tough place. Enormous opportunities, great potential, for someone like myself, English, cricket, etc. But I just want to ask you, its political system, as much as that is a blessing or an advantage, it's also perhaps seen as I wouldn't use the word curse, but getting things done. And in this country, a lot of our companies, a lot of our institutions wanting to do things in India, it always comes up, things move slowly, where's the light at the end of the tunnel? There is great determination in this country to do things in India. And I sense that amongst the business people in India, there is a reciprocal interest and determination in the business community. But I'm just wondering, from your knowledge and your expertise, can you perhaps give some comments about how to do things more efficiently, or to that productivity and that connectivity that can actually contribute to greater outcomes? Thanks.
That's a great question, and it's also a huge dilemma that India does face. But I think there is still room for optimism about India, even though in the last 2 years we've seen a slowdown in their growth momentum. Because I think some of the fundamentals are still very positive. The young demographics are very important. Also, I think if you look at the last 10 years, the corporate sector of India is completely transformed. It's now a very dynamic, globalized sector with a lot of Indian multinationals operating globally. If you look at Tata, for example, or Reliance, these are international companies with a lot of leading technology now. So I think that's probably some of the positives. There's also been a huge surge of foreign direct investment into India since 2007, and that's continued to be at a very high level in the recent years. So these are some of the positives. I think the political system is a big constraint because At the moment, you have coalition politics. It's just the nature of the Indian economy, political system at the moment, that you have on both sides of the house governments that would tend to be coalition governments that rely on the support of minority parties. But I think it's also about leadership. I think, we have had periods when you've had more dynamic reform momentum under certain leadership. And actually right now the new finance minister who had the post before has again introduced a new vitality in the reform program, both on the fiscal side and on the foreign direct investment side as well. So I still think that India, although it's a difficult democratic process, there is room for optimism.
That's such a big question, you can go on and on, and you're right.
We can take it
I agree,
offline
but,
later.
it's a good question to consider briefly. I think we are coming down to the end of our session. We don't want to eat in somebody else's time. But maybe the panelists, to be fair, if there's any comment you want to make, which is particularly earth-shaking, then is useful. Anyone?
I think I'm quite confident about this region. And this region, Asia-Pacific region, is going to be the next engine of drive for global economy, not just China, the region.
Thank you. That's a nice note to end on, but there may be some who may disagree. Whatever it is, I think, I must make a confession quickly. I spoke to the ambassador and I said, I believe that in China, you used to shoot people who are corrupt, following up on what Rajiv was saying about corruption. It's a deadly shock, if we're talking about shock. But he says, no, only if it's for drugs and criminal activities. I wish to include corruption, and we shoot guys who are corrupt, then we'll shoot up a lot of politicians. And the non-politicians can then take over. Well, that's just a light note. I would, if I may, very quickly say, I think we all agree there are many shocks we have faced and survived. 2, shocks will continue by the very nature of life. But 3, it appears that all 3 panelists are quite confident, in varying degrees, that we will overcome these shocks. And for the time being, we're relying on China, but if you rely too much on China, China itself may generate a shock. But one thing is clear in my mind, at least, listening to the panelists carefully and all of you who raise questions, is that there's a lot we can do to prevent shocks. And this is the lesson we must all learn all over the world, and particularly here because it's the context of Asia, which is don't make the mistakes of the US and Europe in practicing bad governance. You neglect investment, you go for consumption, you neglect savings, this is basic. You're bound to get deficits, balance of payments, and beyond which point sometime you can't control. Now hopefully we've all learned these lessons, that we ourselves will practice better governance, because I think we are at risk for falling into the same trap in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And hopefully US and Europe, having learned these lessons, will bounce back more strongly, and we will all gain from it and live happily ever after. Thank you very much for your patience and your understanding and your participation. And we want you to join me in giving a hearty clap to all the panelists who have done exceedingly well. Thank you, sir.
And a round of applause to the moderator, Tan Sri Raymond Navaratnam. Thank you, Tan Sri.